The first mistake Hayden made wasn't dragging a bleeding man into her apartment. It was giving him the good blanket. You don't invite a stray into your home when you're barely surviving yourself, especially one whose torn, blood-soaked jacket costs more than your entire year's rent. Hayden's left boot leaked. That was the primary tragedy of her Tuesday. Water seeped through a crack in the faux leather near the toe, turning her cheap cotton sock into a freezing, squelching sponge with every step. She turned the key in the glass door of Marty's diner, pulling it shut. Above her, the neon open sign buzzed a dying fluorescent death rattle before flicking off. It was 11:40 p.m. The rain was coming down in sharp diagonal sheets, driven by a wind that smelled of wet asphalt and impending snow. Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman who watched Hayden's 6-year-old son, charged $10 an hour. Every minute Hayden stood in the freezing sleet was a dime she didn't have. Poverty was above all things unrelenting math. Hayden pulled up the collar of her thrifted parka and began the sprint toward her dying 2004 Honda. Then she heard it. It was a wet, hollow cough coming from the alleyway between the diner and the neighboring laundromat right by the grease traps. Don't look, she told herself. Her fingers tightened around her keys. The jagged metal dug into her palm a sharp, grounding pain. She had $42 in her checking account. She had a kid who was rapidly outgrowing his winter coat. She did not have the capital for empathy. Empathy was a luxury good, and Hayden was priced out. But the cough came again, rattling, desperate. She stopped. Cursing audibly, she pivoted on her good boot and walked toward the narrow pitch-black gap between the brick buildings. The smell hit her first. It was a potent mix of rotting lettuce stale beer and the sharp, bright tang of raw copper. Blood. A lot of it. A man was curled into a tight, rigid knot against the brick wall, half hidden behind a rusted dumpster. Drunks had a certain looseness to them, a boneless slump. This man was completely tense, shivering so violently his heels scraped against the wet pavement. His dark coat was smeared with the slick, foul runoff of the diner's garbage. "Hey," Hayden barked. Her voice wasn't soft. It was the voice of a woman who argued with collection agencies on her lunch break. The man didn't move. Hayden sighed a heavy exhalation of pure exhaustion. "Look, buddy, you can't sleep here. Marty comes at 6 in the morning and he'll call the cops. Or hit you with a broom. Usually the broom first." The man shifted. Slowly, agonizingly, he tilted his head up. The weak amber glow of the street lamp bled into the alley, catching his face. It was a mess. His left eye was swollen shut, the flesh turning a brilliant, angry violet. A jagged cut tore down his jawline, and blood had crusted black beneath his nose. Yet his right eye, pale gray and startlingly clear, locked onto hers. He didn't look terrified. He looked profoundly, intensely annoyed. "Lost my phone," he rasped. His voice was dry, scraping against his throat like sandpaper. "Clearly you lost a fight, too," Hayden said, stepping a few inches closer. She squinted. Despite the grime and the grease, the fabric of his coat caught her attention. It was thick, heavy wool. The cut was structured. It didn't look like it came from the donation bins at the shelter. "Are you calling an ambulance?" he asked, attempting to push himself up before collapsing back with a sharp hiss of pain. "Do you have good insurance?" she shot back. He blinked, a slow, confused drag of his eyelid. Yes. I don't. And my phone is dead." Hayden looked over her shoulder at her Honda parked under the flickering streetlight. She looked back at him. She hated herself. She truly, deeply hated the soft, idiotic part of her brain that forced her to step forward and grab him by the shoulder. "Get up," he groaned. "My ribs." "Gravity is free. Use it to stand." She hauled him upward. He was incredibly heavy, carrying the dense, solid weight of someone who ate well and worked out. As his arm draped over her shoulders, her nose was inches from his neck. Underneath the overpowering stench of the garbage, he smelled faint but distinct. Cedar wood, vetiver, something crisp and expensive. It made absolutely no sense. He stumbled his boots, scraping the pavement. Hayden gritted her teeth, bearing half his weight as they began the agonizing 50-foot trek to her car. Every step was a negotiation. "You're soaking wet," he mumbled, his head lolling slightly toward her. "Astute observation." She grunted, unlocking the passenger side of the Honda. She shoved him in. He dropped onto the torn fabric seat with a heavy thud. She slammed the door, marched around to the driver's side, and got in. The engine cranked, choked, and finally roared to life, shaking the entire chassis. Hayden blasted the heat, which only managed to blow lukewarm, dust-scented air into their faces. The man leaned his head against the fogged window. "I'm Hayes," he murmured. "I didn't ask," Hayden said, throwing the car into drive. "Don't bleed on my upholstery, Hayes. It's the only nice thing I own." Hayden's apartment smelled perpetually of damp drywall and cheap lavender aerosol. It was a scent designed to cover up the fact that the building was slowly rotting from the inside out. She practically dragged Hayes up the 2 flights of stairs, his heavy arm crushing her collarbone. By the time she kicked her apartment door open, her lungs were burning. She dumped him onto the living room sofa. It was an ugly plaid thing she'd found on the curb 3 years ago, covered in a faded fleece throw. "Stay," she ordered, as if he were a disobedient dog. She walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway to Mrs. Gable's apartment. She handed the woman a crumpled $20 bill, retrieved her sleeping son Leo, and carried him back. Leo was a dead weight against her chest, smelling of milk and crayons. She laid him gently in his bed, pulled the thin comforter up to his chin, and closed his bedroom door with a soft click. When she returned to the living room, Hayes was exactly where she'd left him, though his gray eye was open, tracking her movements. "You live here," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, heavy with something Hayden couldn't quite place. Pity, disgust. "No, I break into random apartments to stash bleeding men." Hayden snapped, walking into the tiny kitchenette. She ran the tap until the water turned from rust brown to somewhat clear, filling a chipped mug. She walked back and shoved it into his hand. "Drink. Then I'm cleaning your face. Then you're going to sleep. Tomorrow you leave." Hayes gripped the mug. His knuckles were bruised, the skin broken. He lifted the water to his lips and drank. It tasted like chlorine and old pipes. He drained it anyway. Hayden returned with a plastic first aid kit she'd bought at a dollar store. She sat on the edge of the coffee table, her knees nearly touching his. "This is going to sting. The peroxide expired in 2024, so I don't know if it works better or worse." She didn't wait for his permission. She doused a cotton ball and pressed it hard against the gash on his jaw. Hayes flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. As she worked, Hayes watched her. He was accustomed to women who smelled of Le Labo and existed in carefully curated environments of beige cashmere and glass. The woman in front of him smelled of fryer grease, cheap vanilla lotion, and sweat. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy utilitarian knot. Her hands swiping the cotton ball across his skin were red-knuckled. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. There was a frantic, vibrating energy to her, like a wire pulled too tight. "Why didn't you leave me there?" he asked quietly. Hayden paused. She looked at the blood on the cotton ball, then tossed it into a plastic grocery bag she'd hung on the edge of the table. "Because dead bodies in the alley bring the cops. Cops run plates. My registration is 6 months expired. I can't afford the ticket." It was a lie. A harsh, pragmatic shield to cover up the fatal flaw of her bleeding heart. Hayes knew it was a lie immediately, but he didn't press. "I was mugged," he said instead, leaning back against the cheap pillows. 3 men. They took my wallet, my phone, my watch." A watch, Hayden thought. Who even wears watches anymore unless they cost more than a car? "Well, you're alive," she said, twisting the cap back onto the peroxide bottle. "You can call someone in the morning to come get you. I have a landline. It's strictly for emergencies and dodging debt collectors, so make it quick." She stood up, her joints popping in the quiet room. She walked to the linen closet, pulled out a heavy knitted blanket, the only one that actually held heat, and tossed it at him. It landed over his legs. "There's a bucket next to the sofa if you need to throw up. Bathroom is down the hall. Don't wake my kid." She walked toward her bedroom, stopping in the doorway. She turned back, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. "And Hayes." "Yeah. I sleep with a baseball bat under my bed. Don't get any ideas." Hayes let out a short, breathy laugh that immediately turned into a wince as his ribs flared. "Noted." Hayden shut her door. In the dark, she locked the deadbolt. She didn't have a baseball bat. She had a heavy flashlight, but the batteries were dead. She lay down on her mattress, fully clothed, listening to the heavy, uneven breathing of the stranger in her living room. On the sofa, Hayes stared at the ceiling. A water stain in the corner was spreading, shaped vaguely like a continent. He was the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. 12 hours ago, he had finalized a hostile takeover that netted him $40 million in stock options. He had walked out of his glass-paneled office, dismissed his driver, and taken a walk to clear the buzzing in his head. He had wanted to feel something real. His jaw throbbed. His ribs felt like shattered glass. He pulled the cheap, heavy blanket up to his chin. It smelled mildly of dust and lavender. For the first time in 3 years, Hayes closed his eyes and slept without waking up once. The radiator in the corner of the living room woke Hayes by clanking violently, sounding like a man trapped inside with a hammer. He opened his eyes. The stark gray morning light filtered through cheap plastic blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. His body was a map of localized agony. Every muscle seized as he tried to sit up. From the kitchen, the smell of burnt toast and bitter coffee drifted in. "You're awake," Hayden said. She walked into his line of sight holding a mug. She was dressed in dark blue scrubs, her hair still wet from the shower. She looked even more tired in the daylight. The dark circles under her eyes were prominent, bruised-looking smudges against her pale skin. "What time is it?" he croaked. His throat felt full of sand. 7:30. I have to drop Leo at school, and then I have a shift at the clinic." She set 2 white pills and a glass of water on the coffee table. "Take those. They're generic ibuprofen. It's all I've got." Hayes reached for them. His hand was shaking slightly. A cold sweat had broken out across his forehead, despite the freezing temperature of the room. Hayden frowned, her eyes narrowing. She stepped forward and pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. Her skin was cool, calloused. "Damn it," she muttered, pulling her hand back. "You're burning up." "I'm fine," Hayes said, swallowing the pills with a mouthful of water. "You're running a fever, probably from the cuts. Or you caught pneumonia sleeping by a dumpster." She ran a hand over her face, a gesture of pure frustration. "I can't stay. I will lose my job if I miss this shift. Go." Hayes said, his voice stronger this time. I just need a phone. I'll call someone to come get me. Hayden gestured toward the kitchen counter. Cordless is on the base. Dial 9 to get out. Don't order any pay-per-view on the TV. A small boy peeked around the corner of the hallway. He had Hayden's dark hair and large, solemn brown eyes. He was wearing a winter coat that was clearly 2 sizes too small, the cuffs riding high up his wrists. Mom, Leo asked, staring at the bruised man on their couch. It's okay, Bug, Hayden said, her voice instantly dropping, its harsh edge softening into something warm and fiercely protective. This is Hayes. He had a little accident, so he's resting here. Grab your backpack. Leo stared at Hayes for another long second, then vanished back down the hall. Lock the door when you leave, Hayden told Hayes. Just pull it shut. It locks automatically. 10 minutes later, the apartment was empty. The silence left in Hayden's wake was deafening. Hayes pushed himself off the sofa. The room spun for a sickening moment before stabilizing. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and shuffled toward the kitchen. The linoleum was icy under his bare feet. He found the phone on the counter. Beside it was a stack of mail. Hayes didn't mean to snoop. But in his world, information was currency, and he was currently bankrupt. He glanced down. Final notice. Past due. Shut-off warning. The envelopes were stamped in aggressive red ink. There was an electric bill, a medical bill from a pediatrician, and a letter from the property management company threatening eviction if the balance wasn't paid by the 15th. Today was the 12th. Hayes stared at the numbers. The total amount Hayden owed to keep a roof over her child's head was less than what Hayes routinely tipped the maître d' at his favorite steakhouse. A sharp, uncomfortable tightness seized his chest, entirely unrelated to his bruised ribs. He picked up the phone. He dialed his executive assistant's private number. It rang twice. Yes, Sarah's crisp professional voice answered. Sarah, it's me. A pause. Mr. Sterling Jesus, where have you been? The board has been panicking. The police were about to be called. Hold off on the police. I had an incident. I'm fine. He leaned heavily against the cheap laminate counter. I need you to do something. Do you need a car? Sent a doctor? No. Hayes looked around the kitchen. He looked at the cracked cabinets, the empty jar of peanut butter washed and drying by the sink, to be reused as a glass. The broken plastic toy car taped carefully back together on the windowsill. The sheer inequality of it all felt like a physical blow. He made his living optimizing supply chains, cutting costs, eliminating redundancies. People like Hayden were the redundancies his algorithms cut. I need you to freeze my schedule for the next 3 days, Hayes said. Excuse me, sir, the Vanguard merger. Delay it. Hayes coughed, his chest burning. And Sarah, I need you to pull the property records for a building. Address is 412 West Elm East District. Find out who owns it. He hung up before she could argue. Hayes walked back to the living room. The fever was spiking, blurring the edges of his vision. He fell back onto the lumpy sofa, pulling Hayden's blanket tight around him. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. When Hayden returned at 6 o'clock that evening, the apartment was dark. She flicked on the light, shucking her wet coat. Her shoulders slumped with a bone-deep weariness. She stopped in the living room. Hayes was still there. He was sitting upright, a damp washcloth resting on the coffee table. The fever seemed to have broken. His eyes were clearer, though he looked pale and exhausted. You didn't call anyone? Hayden said flatly. No one was available. Hayes lied smoothly. His voice was calm. Hayden let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. Right, okay. So I'm running a flophouse now. She walked into the kitchen, dropping a plastic grocery bag onto the counter. I bought soup, the cheap kind. I hope you like chicken noodle with more sodium than chicken." Hayes watched her. She unpacked the bag with sharp, angry movements. A can of soup, a loaf of white bread, a small box of crayons. Suddenly, Hayden stopped. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter. Her knuckles turned white. She lowered her head, and for a long, agonizing minute, she just stood there. She didn't sob. She didn't make a sound. But Hayes saw the subtle, frantic tremor in her shoulders. It was the physical manifestation of someone who had hit the absolute bottom of their endurance and was desperately trying to claw their way back up before their kids saw them break. Hayes stood. He crossed the small distance between the living room and the kitchen. He didn't touch her. He knew better than to touch a feral thing when it was hurting, but he stood close enough that she knew he was there. "What happened today?" he asked quietly. Hayden scrubbed a hand furiously across her eyes, turning her face away. "Nothing. Just life. The transmission in my car is slipping. If it goes, I lose my jobs. If I lose my jobs, we lose the apartment." She laughed a brittle, awful sound. "Dominoes. Just waiting for the wind to blow." She turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "Why are you still here, Hayes? Look at this place. I have nothing to steal. I have nothing to give you." Hayes looked at her. He looked at the fierce, unyielding pride in her jaw, the sheer bloody-minded determination that kept her standing. "I don't want to take anything from you, Hayden," Hayes said softly, stepping closer. The smell of vetiver cut through the scent of damp drywall. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The next 3 days dissolved into a strange, suffocating domesticity that Hayden deeply resented, yet quietly craved. Hayes didn't leave. He occupied the lumpy plaid sofa like a dethroned king, his bruising shifting from violent violet to a sickly, jaundiced yellow. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't promise to fix her slipping transmission or magically pay the overdue rent. He simply stayed observing the brutal, rhythmic machinery of her survival. He learned that Leo liked his toast burnt to a crisp carbon edge, scraping the black ash off with a butter knife so it sounded like sandpaper on wood. He learned that Hayden drank her coffee so fiercely black and bitter it could strip paint from the walls. He learned the exact floorboards to avoid stepping on when moving down the narrow hallway, so he wouldn't wake the boy. In return, Hayden learned that Hayes was unnervingly quiet. He didn't fill the silence with useless chatter. When he looked at her, his pale gray eyes didn't hold the patronizing pity she was used to getting from social workers or the clinic doctors. He looked at her like she was a structural pillar bearing an impossible load, studying where the cracks were forming. Thursday brought the cold. A bitter biting frost settled over the city, turning the rain puddles in the cracked asphalt into slick sheets of gray ice. Hayden's shift at the clinic ran 2 hours late. Her feet felt like blocks of lead inside her damp boots. She smelled of antiseptic stale waiting room coffee and the metallic tang of dried blood from a patient's split lip. She turned the key in the ignition of the Honda. The engine choked. It sputtered a dry grating sound that vibrated up through the steering column and rattled her teeth. She tried again. A high-pitched whine followed by a heavy metallic clank. Then absolute silence. Hayden gripped the steering wheel. The faux leather cover was icy beneath her bare, cracked knuckles. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Crying required energy she had long ago rationed out to more important things, like breathing. Instead, a hollow buzzing numbness spread through her chest. The transmission was gone. The domino had fallen. It took her 45 minutes to walk home in the biting wind, her face completely numb, her eyelashes heavy with frost. When she unlocked the apartment door, the smell hit her first. It wasn't the usual scent of damp drywall and cheap lavender. It smelled like garlic toasted butter and actual hot food. She dropped her keys into the plastic bowl by the door. They landed with a sharp clatter. She walked into the tiny kitchenette, her wet boots squeaking against the peeling linoleum. Hayes was standing by the stove. He was still wearing the dark, heavy wool pants he'd arrived in, though he had discarded the ruined jacket. His white button-down shirt was rolled up to his elbows, exposing thick forearms dusted with dark hair. He was stirring a pot of cheap tomato soup, but he had added something to it. Next to him, a plate of grilled cheese sandwiches sat cooling the bread, perfectly golden cheese oozing from the sides. "You're late," he said, not looking up from the stove. His voice had lost its gravelly rasp, returning to a smooth, resonant baritone. Hayden stared at his back. "Where did you get butter? We were out of butter." "I found a few dollars in the cushions of the sofa." I walked down to the bodega at the corner. He turned off the burner, finally looking at her. His gaze swept over her freezing, shivering frame, snagging on her pale lips. "You're frozen. Sit down." "Don't tell me what to do," Hayden snapped. It was a reflex, a knee-jerk defense mechanism against anyone trying to manage her. But her legs betrayed her trembling so violently, she had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. "I'm not managing you, Hayden. I'm feeding you. There's a difference." Hayes pulled out one of the rickety wooden chairs from the small dining table. The legs scraped against the floor. "Sit." She sat. She didn't have the strength to fight. Hayes slid a chipped ceramic bowl of steaming red soup in front of her, followed by a sandwich. The heat radiating from the bowl was intoxicating. "Where is Leo?" Hayes asked, leaning against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "Mrs. Gables. He fell asleep watching cartoons. She said I could leave him there for the night so I didn't have to drag him through the cold." Hayden picked up the spoon. Her hand was shaking. She took a bite. It was just canned soup, but he had added garlic powder and pepper, and the butter on the bread was rich and heavy. It tasted like salvation. She ate in silence for 3 minutes, the hot liquid slowly thawing the ice in her veins. The radiator clanked its rhythmic, metallic heartbeat. "My car died," she said to the empty bowl. The words tasted like ash. The transmission finally went. "It's sitting in the clinic parking lot. I have to be at the diner at 5 in the morning, and it's a 4-mile walk." Hayes didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He just watched her, his expression entirely unreadable. "What happens now?" "Now." Hayden let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Now I lose the diner job because I can't be late. Then I lose this apartment because tomorrow is the 15th. Mr. Gorski, the landlord, comes at 8 a.m. sharp. He doesn't take partial payments. He takes the keys." She looked down at her hands. The knuckles were raw, the skin split and bleeding slightly from the cold. "I did the math. I always do the math. I kept us afloat for 3 years after his dad walked out. But the math finally caught up. A thick, heavy silence stretched between them. The apartment felt smaller, pressing in on them. Hayes pushed himself off the counter. He walked around the small table and pulled out the other chair sitting directly across from her. He was too large for the fragile furniture. "Why did his father leave?" Hayes asked. It was an invasion of privacy, a line he shouldn't have crossed, but his voice was completely devoid of judgment. "Because poverty is ugly," Hayden said, staring him dead in the eyes. "It makes people mean. It makes you argue over a $2 carton of milk until you're screaming at each other." He couldn't handle the noise of it, the constant grinding panic. So he packed a bag and got on a bus. He was weak, Hayes stated plainly. He was human. Most people break when you apply enough pressure. Hayden pushed the empty bowl away. You should leave tomorrow, Hayes, before Gorski gets here. He's a nasty piece of work. You don't want to be here when the screaming starts. Hayes looked at her empty bowl, then up at her bruised, exhausted face. I'm not going anywhere. Friday morning arrived wrapped in a shroud of freezing gray fog. Hayden was awake at 4, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. She didn't go to the diner. She couldn't. She stayed in her bed, listening to the agonizing ticking of the cheap plastic wall clock in the kitchen. 7 o'clock, 7:30. At exactly 8 a.m., the heavy thunderous pounding started. Bang! 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 The front door rattled on its cheap hinges. Hayden squeezed her eyes shut. Her stomach twisted into a violent, sickening knot. Hayden, open the damn door. Mr. Gorski's voice boomed through the thin wood. He sounded exactly like he smelled like stale cigar smoke, old sweat, and cheap cologne. It's the 15th open up, or I'm bringing the drill for the lock. Hayden swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. Her bare feet hit the cold floor. She pulled her worn cardigan tight around her chest and walked out of her bedroom. Hayes was already in the living room. He was standing perfectly still, watching the door vibrate with another heavy knock. He looked different today. The bruising had faded enough to reveal the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw. He stood with a rigid, imposing posture that suddenly made the small apartment feel like a cage he was merely tolerating. I'll handle it, Hayden whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. She stepped past him, unlocking the deadbolt and pulling the door open just a few inches. Gorski wedged his heavy steel-toed boot into the gap before she could close it. He was a massive, sweating man with a flushed face and small, cruel eyes. Time's up, sweetheart. I warned you last month. You have the rent and the late fees, or you have your bags packed. Which is it? Mr. Gorski, my car broke down. Hayden started hating the pathetic, reedy sound of her own voice. I just need 3 days. I get paid from the clinic on Monday. I have half the money right now. I don't run a charity, Gorski spat, pushing his weight against the door. Hayden stumbled back the door, swinging wide open. Gorski stepped into the apartment, bringing the smell of cold hallway air and tobacco with him. Get your kid. Get your stuff. You have exactly 1 hour before I call the sheriff. She isn't going anywhere. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a steel blade. Gorski stopped. He squinted, noticing Hayes standing in the shadows by the kitchen counter. Who the hell are you? You got a squatter in here, Hayden. That's another violation. Hayes stepped forward into the gray morning light. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture or puff out his chest. He moved with the terrifying absolute confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. My name is Hayes, he said smoothly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. It wasn't the burner Hayden assumed he'd eventually borrow. It was a piece of high-end encrypted hardware. And as of 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon, my holding company purchased this building along with the entire block of properties managed by your firm. Hayden stopped breathing. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. Gorski let out a bark of rough laughter. Are you out of your mind, buddy? Vanguard Real Estate bought this block. I am the CEO of Vanguard Logistics and its subsidiaries, Hayes said. His pale eyes locked onto Gorski's. There was no warmth in them, only a cold, clinical execution. You should check your email, Mr. Gorski. You were terminated effective at midnight for a history of gross negligence, predatory late fees, and failure to maintain basic safety codes. If you are still on my property in 30 seconds, I will have my legal team drown you in so much litigation, you'll be paying legal fees until you die." Gorski stared. His face lost its flush, draining to a pasty, sickly gray. He looked at the phone in Hayes' hand, then at the expensive cut of his wool trousers, finally realizing the fabric wasn't thrifted. He didn't say another word. Gorski pulled his boot back, turned on his heel, and walked quickly down the hall. The heavy silence rushed back and ringing in Hayden's ears. She stood frozen in the middle of the worn rug. Her brain frantically tried to process the data. CEO Vanguard bought the building. The pieces slammed together, forming a picture that made her stomach violently heave. She turned slowly to face him. Hayes put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at her, his expression softening, stepping forward with his hand half raised. "Hayden, don't," she gasped, stepping back as if he had held up a lit match. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't touch me." The smell of stale cigar smoke lingered in the open doorway, a foul ghost of the eviction that hadn't happened. Hayden stared at Hayes. The man who had slept on her lumpy sofa, who had eaten her cheap soup, who had bled into her expired peroxide, was a phantom. "You lied to me," she breathed. The words tasted like copper on her tongue. The sheer humiliation of it burned the back of her throat. "I omitted the truth," Hayes replied evenly, though his jaw tightened. He didn't look arrogant. He looked deeply, uncomfortably exposed. "When you found me in that alley, I had been mugged. That was real. The blood was real. But yes, I had the means to leave. Then why didn't you—" Hayden's voice cracked, the volume rising, bouncing harshly off the peeling walls. The numbness of the morning shattered, replaced by a hot, blinding fury. "Was it a game? Poverty tourism? Did you want to see how the rats live before you went back to your penthouse?" She marched toward the door, pointing a shaking finger toward the hallway. "Get out. Get your expensive pants and your encrypted phone and get out of my apartment." Hayes didn't move. He stood his ground, letting her anger crash over him like a wave breaking against a seawall. "I'm not a tourist, Hayden. I stayed because it was the first time in 10 years I felt completely awake." Hayden let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "Oh, I'm so glad my misery was entertaining for you. I'm glad my panic over feeding my child gave you a thrill." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Hayes closed the distance between them. He didn't stop until he was inches away. Hayden could smell the vetiver again mingling with the faint scent of the cheap coffee they had shared. "In my world," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, raw pitch, "everything is an equation. Every conversation is a negotiation. People don't look at me. They look at my net worth. When I was bleeding in the dirt, you didn't see a portfolio. You saw a liability. And you picked me up anyway." He reached out his large, warm hands, gently grasping her freezing, trembling fingers. Hayden tried to pull away, but his grip was firm. Not restraining, but grounding. "I watched you." Hayes continued, his thumb brushing over the raw, cracked knuckles of her hand. "I watched you work yourself to the bone. I watched you protect your son with a ferocity that terrified me. You have more honor, more strength in your broken boots than anyone sitting on my board of directors. I didn't stay to mock you, Hayden. I stayed because my life is entirely hollow and yours is painfully, beautifully real." Hayden stared at his chest, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. The anger in her chest was warring with something far more dangerous. Hope. It was a terrifying, fragile thing. "You bought my building," she whispered, the fight slowly draining out of her, leaving her hollowed out and exhausted. "You bought my life. I can't be a charity case, Hayes. I won't be a kept woman. You're not. Hayes released her hands, taking a deliberate step back to give her space. I bought the building because it was a sound real estate investment. You will pay rent, but you'll pay a fair market rate to a property manager who fixes the heat and doesn't threaten you. And as for your car, Vanguard has a fleet of logistical vehicles. We need a dispatcher. The pay is double what the clinic offers with full dental for Leo. Hayden looked up at him. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a level playing field, Hayes corrected softly. The pale gray of his eyes was intensely focused, stripping away all the corporate armor. Because once you aren't drowning, once you don't have to choose between electricity and groceries, I want to take you to dinner. A real dinner. And I want you to say yes, because you want to, not because you owe me. The silence returned, but the sharp, heavy pressure was gone. The apartment still smelled like damp drywall. The radiator still clanked. Nothing was magically fixed. There was no fairy tale sweep into a waiting limousine. There was just a man standing in her kitchen, offering her the one thing she hadn't had in years of choice. Hayden looked at the open doorway, then back at Hayes. Her pulse drummed a steady grounding beat in her ears. She crossed her arms, her lips twitching into a cautious, deeply tired, but genuine smile. The rent better be prorated for the broken radiator, she said. Hayes let out a short, breathy laugh, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. It's already in the lease. And if you think I'm wearing a dress to this dinner, Hayden added, her voice regaining its familiar sharp edge, you're out of your mind. I wouldn't expect anything less, Hayes murmured. He didn't sweep her into a kiss. He didn't make a grand declaration. He simply walked to the door, pulled it shut, and locked the deadbolt from the inside, staying exactly where he belonged. If Hayden's raw strength and Hayes' unexpected vulnerability kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button. We all crave stories where love isn't about saving someone, but about standing beside them in the trenches. Share this with a friend who loves a grounded, slow-burn romance that breaks all the cliches. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next deeply emotional human story. See you in the next one.